When Jeff Morris blew the whistle on financial misconduct at Australia's biggest bank, the corporate regulator didn't act.
It continues to fail consumers year in, year out. There's never any action. Nobody at ASIC is ever held to account for their failures.
A 20-month-long Senate inquiry into the corporate watchdog is calling for an overhaul.
It's had a bad culture, and that has meant that there's been a white flag waved on white-collar crime, which has meant that people feel they have a licence to break the law in Australia.
The inquiry made 11 recommendations, including splitting the regulator into two bodies, one focused on companies and issues like insider trading, and the other on consumer complaints. Both bodies would need to ramp up the number of cases they investigate after the inquiry heard only about 1% of reports are looked into. A new public register of civil and criminal cases would be set up, and whistleblowers could be given financial rewards.
They said that there would be compensation for banking whistleblowers. That was 5 years ago. I'm yet to see any of that. They promised they would protect whistleblowers, there'd be a whistleblower protection agency. So the gap between their rhetoric and the reality is enormous.
Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg, who chaired the inquiry, says it could take years for new regulators to be set up, but is calling for bipartisan support.
I would say that if there is a corporate crime happening in Australia, right now it's probably more likely to be investigated if it's reported to the media than reported to ASIC.
ASIC says it needs more time to consider the report, but it maintains it's in court almost every day pursuing wrongdoing, and that over the past 12 months alone, it's launched about 180 new investigations. The report also calls for changes to the regulator's funding so that more money comes from fines dished out against companies rather than levies placed on industry. Legal experts say ASIC's remit is too wide, allowing the same problems to occur.
6 years after the Hayne Royal Commission, across a sample of just 10 super funds, so not the whole superannuation industry, just 10 super funds, almost 500,000 superannuation members were still being charged fees for no service, and those fees for no service amounted to almost $1 billion a year.
Andy Shmulo says the organisation is in chaos.
It's in free fall, it doesn't know how to do its job, it's lost sight of doing its job, it's too busy running around Parliament lobbying MPs and planting Dorothy Dixes. It's off the leash, it's off the reservation, it's out of control.
At a time when Australia needs a tough corporate cop.
Chief Business Correspondent Ian Verinder has been looking back at ASIC's checkered history. Ian, how did we get here?
Good question, Rachel. Look, it's been, I guess, a history of just appalling performance by ASIC. And it's a sorry tale, really. I mean, if you compare Australia to America, America really knows how to enforce its corporate laws, and they have no hesitation going in, arresting corporate leaders, locking them up, taking them to court, and getting it all done in a very short space of time. Whether it's partly the result of the law here is questionable, but there's certainly no doubt that ASIC as a regulator has failed and failed miserably. And I guess the rot really set in probably about 20 years ago when it decided that it would not simply pursue criminal investigations, but would expand it out into civil litigation so that it could spread its wings, because the burden of proof for civil litigation was lower than criminal cases. And then it just embarked upon a series of civil cases such as OneTel, which it failed miserably at, and then it decided to just not pursue court cases at all.
You mentioned the US, and there's obviously some very stark differences. Is this potentially a missed opportunity to create some tougher penalties here?
Well, not just tougher penalties, but possibly a rewrite of the Corporations Act to make it clearer, easier to understand, and probably a much better environment for a regulator to be able to get in to do a proper job, so that everybody does understand the laws, understands where they can go. I mean, ASIC has decided over the years too to pursue people who are defenceless. So it doesn't undertake very many criminal actions or civil actions, but when it does, it's usually individuals or smaller companies. You know, smaller fish to fry, I think was one of their mottos, joking. But that just seems to be the way they operate.
One of the recommendations was to split ASIC into two. Would that give it more teeth?
Yeah, I think so. You'd at least hope so, because one of the big problems that ASIC has, it's not just a law enforcement agency, it's actually a revenue generation for the federal government. It brings in around about $2 billion each year from operating its data services, corporate registrations, all sorts of things like that. And its budget to actually enforce the law is around about a quarter of that. And so clearly, if you were running the organisation, you'd probably have your main focus on generating as much revenue as you could, rather than just simply doing your job as a law enforcement agency. So I think separating those two things would be crucial to getting ASIC back on track as a law enforcement body.
I mentioned it has a checkered history. What are some of the sort of big cases that have been missed opportunities as such?
We've seen what's gone on in the banks, financial planners and so forth. I mean, at one stage, just before the Banking Royal Commission, there was something like $200 million worth of penalties that had been meted out to the banks, and yet there were no criminal prosecutions for any of these things. I mean, we knew exactly what had gone wrong, and instead what ASIC has done over the past few years, or over the past decade or more, is resort to enforceable undertakings. So it would catch some big corporation in the act doing the wrong thing, actually involved in theft most of the time, and rather than pursue it through the courts, they would say, you do this one more time and we're going to get really angry and maybe we'll do something about it. So, you know, AMP was a classic case. 2006, ASIC, you know, gave AMP enforceable undertakings. And then, you know, what did we find out in the Royal Commission? They'd still been doing the same thing all the way through that period from then on.
Ian Verinder, thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel.